Today we have some more actual history about the early days of our American Republic. We will be reading a family history given by Letita Preston Floyd, the former First Lady of Virginia, to her son Rush in 1843. She tells about the heroism of his ancestors from the Draper's Meadow Massacre in 1755 and the French and Indian War, to the United States Revolution in the western settlements of Kentucky, and then into the Battle of Tippecanoe and the War of 1812. She tells her son of his ancestors who played pivotal roles in these events. The beginning of today's episode follows up our recent episode where we read the Ingles family account of the Draper's Meadow Massacre in 1755. The account we will read today has several major differences from the Ingles family accounts. Letita Preston Floyd's great-grand-uncle was Colonel James Patton, who was killed in the massacre. So this account comes from the Patton and Preston families rather than the Draper and Ingles families. This manuscript was originally written for the historian Lyman Draper to use in one of his books, but it was never published. In 2016, Jim Glanville and Ryan Mays published a transcript of the letter in Volume 20 of the Smithfield Review. I will now read a part of their introduction, followed by the letter. Letita Preston Floyd was born on the Virginia frontier, in the newly created Montgomery County. Her parents were the Scotch-Irish immigrant William Preston of Augusta County and Susan Smith of Hanover County. In 1804, she married John Floyd in Kentucky, and went on to become a plantation owner, the mother of 12 children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood and marriage, and the First Lady of Virginia. The My Dear Rush letter is a 32-page manuscript written by Mrs. Floyd dated February 22, 1843. The authors of this article discovered the original copy of this document in January of 2014, after its being closely held within the Preston family for 161 years, and 10 further years in a Smithfield closet, in a storage box at the Smithfield plantation. The manuscript is in the form of a letter to her son, Benjamin Rush Floyd, and because of its opening salutation, is referred to as the My Dear Rush letter. The letter was written at her home, on the Cabin Estate in Burke's Garden, in Tazewell County, Virginia, at the instigation of the historian Lyman Draper. The letter is in Mrs. Floyd's own hands, and records many things that can be found nowhere else in the historical record. It is also a crucial document for understanding the European settling of southwest Virginia that was spearheaded by her great-uncle James Patton and her father William Preston. Additionally, the letter is foundational for the study of the westward expansion of America during the early Republic period. It is the most significant of all writings about the early history of the Patton, Preston, Floyd, Breckinridge, and other families in Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Cavan, February 22, 1843. My dear Rush, from the extreme rigor of the winter and diminished vision, I have postponed answering your letter of December 30th, enclosing one for Mr. Lyman C. Draper of Buffalo, New York. The object of Mr. Draper's letter is to collect materials for a work, Sketches of the Pioneers, though it be irrelevant in reply to repeat the traditions I have so often interested your childhood with on the facts of the life and death of Colonel James Patton, etc. He was born in the north of Ireland, in the town of Newton, Limavady, in the year of our Lord 1690. He was bred to the sea, and in the wars of England with the Low Countries, served as an officer in the Royal Navy. After the Treaty of Utrecht made in 1713, he procured a passenger ship, and traded to the colony of Virginia, at Hobbs Hole on the Rappahannock. He penetrated the then wilderness of the state as far as Orange County, thence across the Blue Ridge, and commenced a settlement near Waynesboro, in Augusta County. He crossed the Atlantic 23 or 25 times. His traffic was peltries and tobacco. His return cargo was what was then termed redemptioners, poor families of Irish, who served a given time for the price of the passage. In this way, the greater part of the county of Augusta was settled. The descendants of these immigrants have furnished the West with many of its governors, senators, judges, and distinguished literary men, and even intermarried with the imperial family of Virginia, as the historian Burke terms the Pocahontas descendants of our state. Colonel Patton had two sisters who married men of quality, as the nieces termed them. This state of things kept two other sisters unmarried. The youngest sister, Elizabeth, crossing the river Shannon in a boat, was much attracted by the beauty and deportment of a young man, whose name was John Preston. On inquiry, he was found to be a ship carpenter. Nothing daunted by his humble pursuits, an understanding took place, and Miss Patton consented to a runaway match. This step placed her out of the pale of her family. Her brother Colonel James Patton had by this time obtained governmental distinction in Virginia, as well as a grant of land from Governor Dinwiddie of 200,000 or 300,000 acres. Colonel Patton determined to remove his family from Whitehaven to his residence in Augusta County. He proposed to John Preston, his brother-in-law, to accompany him to America, and for his services as a shipwright, he would secure him 4,000 acres of land. Preston did not hesitate. He embarked with his 3 daughters and his only son, William Preston, who was then 8 years old. In the summer of 1738, both families settled in Augusta, Mr. Preston 7 miles below Stanton, and Patton at Spring Hill. As Preston had left the seaboard, his pursuits were changed, and he worked at the cabinet trade. A silly augury of a native Irish woman, to wit, that William Preston would get his uncle's fortune, so impressed Mrs. Patton, who was a proud, haughty lady, that no intercourse was allowed of in the two families. 7 years after their landing, John Preston died at Gibson's old place, 8 miles below Stanton. Mrs. Preston's situation was then a straitened one. She sent her son to her brothers with a message. The youngest daughter of Colonel Patton knew her cousin, but her mother did not. Peggy, afterwards Mrs. Buchanan, passed William Preston off as a neighbor's son to prevent her mother turning him out of doors. By this time, William Preston was 15 or 16 years of age. Mrs. Patton's dread of his getting the fortune by marriage with one of her daughters urged their early marriage with a kinsman of hers by the name of Thompson, who was a rich man, and the youngest to Colonel John Buchanan. Shortly after their marriage, Mrs. Patton died. This event led her husband to look into the situation of his sister's family. Colonel Patton placed his nephew with the Reverend Mr. Craig, pastor of Tinkling Spring Congregation. A classical education was not attempted because William Preston was thought to be too much grown. However, an excellent course of history, mathematics, and penmanship was afforded. Colonel Patton had the affairs of the then mountain region of the colony, entrusted to him by Governor Dinwiddie. His sister, Mrs. Preston, was induced to remove to Hangers, Judge Baldwin's seat, for the purpose of affording her son the opportunity of posting merchants' books, and doing whatever writing her brother needed. Colonel Patton left his seat and removed to Stanton, and lived at his sister's house. Shortly after that, he was sent to Logstown, somewhere near Pittsburgh, to make a treaty with the Northwestern Indians. William Preston, then 18 years of age, was made his private secretary. I remember to have read Colonel Patton's journal, written by himself, with the speeches of Aconostoto, the old Mingo chief. After peace was made, Colonel Patton came up the extreme western counties, now of this state. He located all the fine lands of Upper James River, Catawba, and the Amsterdam lands in Bodecourt County. He then came to North Roanoke, Strubles Creek, embracing the Blacksburg lands, and Smithfield, the present seat of Governor James Patton Preston. After that he came to Burke's Garden, and the rich valley on Holstein, in which the celebrated salt works of Mrs. Sally Preston and Mr. William King are situated. Colonel Patton tried to rally the settlers to defend the country from the inroads of the Indians on the frontiers of Virginia. This he was unable to effect. All the settlers from South Holstein to South Roanoke left the country, and went below east of the Blue Ridge. Patton maintained his ground, as did Colonel William Ingles, Philip Barger, and Philip Lybrook on Sinking Creek. On the 8th day of July, 1755, it being Sunday, a party of Indians came up the Kanawha River, thence to Sinking Creek, thence to Strubles Creek. Ingles and Draper, brothers-in-law, were living at Solitude, the present residence of Colonel Robert T. Preston. Barger was half a mile nearer to the mountain. The Indians came to Barger's, cut his head off, put it in a bag. Barger was a very old man, and then came to Ingles and Draper's. They killed old Mrs. Draper and 2 children of Colonel Ingles by knocking their brains out on the ends of the cabin logs. They then took Mrs. Ingles and her son Thomas, a boy of 10 years of age, as prisoners, as well as her sister-in-law, Mrs. Draper, who was trying to make her escape with an infant in her arms, but was shot at by the Indians, who broke her arm, by which means the infant was dropped. The Indians caught it up and dashed its brains out on the end of the cabin logs. Colonel Patton that morning, after having dressed himself in his uniform, and getting his nephew, William Preston, to sew up in the fob of his small clothes 30 English guineas, told him to go to Sinking Creek to get Liebrook to help take off the harvest, which was then ready to cut. Preston went very early. After breakfast, Colonel Patton had sat down at his table to write. The Indian war whoop was heard, and some 5 or 6 of them surrounded the cabin to set it on fire. The colonel always kept his sword on the table. He rushed to the door with it in hand, and encountered 2 of them. Patton was almost gigantic in size. He cut 2 of them down. In the meantime, another warrior had leveled his gun, fired, and killed the brave old pioneer. Patton fell. The Indians then ran off in the thicket and made their escape, before any pursuers could be brought together. Liebrook and Preston came through the mountains by an unfrequented route, arrived at Smithfield, then called Draper's Meadow, where they found Patton, Mrs. Draper, the mother of Mrs. Ingles, and the children buried. The whole settlement was destroyed. The Indians, on their retreat back, stopped at Liebrook's. They told old Mrs. Liebrook they had killed 2 men and 1 woman, and 3 children, and to look in the bag and she would see an old friend. She immediately recognized the head of Philip Barger, who was then aged and very gray. Mrs. Ingles, her oldest son, a boy 10 years of age, and her sister-in-law, Mrs. Draper, were taken to the Indian towns on the other side of the Ohio River. They traveled down the Kanawha, or as it is sometimes called, New River, and went through the northeastern part of Kentucky. Mrs. Ingles, in 3 months after her capture, gave birth to a daughter. Her sister-in-law had been traded off to another tribe of Indians, as was her son. 3 months after the birth of her child, she determined to run off from the Indians, who were dreadfully barbarous to her. Another strong impulse to return to her husband made her undertake a journey unparalleled in the incidents of pioneer life. She and a Dutch woman who was taken from the upper part of the Ohio determined to run away from the towns. Mrs. Ingles left her child in a bark cradle asleep, knowing as soon as she was missed, the Indians would kill the infant. A series of remarkable events occurred to them on the route. Mrs. Ingles keeping up the watercourses, when she got to the Ohio River, she and the Dutch woman tied logs together with a grapevine and made a raft, and crossed the stream. They were near perishing of hunger, living on blackberry sassafras leaves, and in one instance eating a snake they had found dead, then a raccoon in a great state of decomposition. All means failing, a proposition was made that lots should be cast, to decide which of them was to be eaten by the other. The lot fell on Mrs. Ingles, who, understanding her traveling companion's temper, promised her a sum of money if she would refrain from killing her. Colonel Ingles was a rich man. This had the desired effect, and the Dutch woman forbore. Mrs. Ingles, however, slipped off, leaving the old woman to find her way as she could. After many weeks' travel, Mrs. Ingles arrived at Ingles Ferry on New River, the then residence of Colonel Ingles. She was afterwards the mother of a highly respectable family, who always have been distinguished for bravery and honesty. Her grandchildren lived on the place that she made such wonderful efforts to return to. These transactions took place the year of Braddock's defeat, 1755. Mrs. Ingles lived to a very great age. I remember to have seen her 50 years ago at a large Baptist association, 30 miles from her home. She was then 80 years old, looked florid and erect. The summer of 1757, Colonel Preston had been appointed commissioner to hold a treaty with the Shawnees and Delaware Indians at the mouth of Big Sandy River, a branch of the Ohio. Colonel Thomas Lewis of Rockingham County was likewise a commissioner. Lewis, I believe, did not accompany the party. The treaty was made, I think, with a Conestoto, who was now very old, and a chief called Cornstalk. Colonel Preston endured singular hardships in this expedition. He had tied his moccasins somewhat too tight. The string chafed the instep of one of his feet, which produced partial mortification. The skills of a physician by the name of Dr. Thomas Lloyd saved his life. Lloyd had been purchased by Preston a year or two previously. Finding him a man of fine education, with great knowledge of medicine, the doctor was made companion and died very many years thereafter, the firm friend of Preston's family. On their return from the mouth of Sandy, they took up a fork of the river which was through a very rugged region, and got so entirely out of food as to be compelled to eat the buffalo tugs, which tied on their packs, and hence the stream was named by Colonel Preston, the Tug Fork of Sandy. The county of Fincastle was taken off Rockbridge County about the year 1764. Colonel Preston obtained the surveyor's place, which determined him to leave Stanton. He settled on Greenfield near Amsterdam, a valuable estate yet in possession of his granddaughter. Having some business to transact in Augusta Court in the month of May, he left his family at Greenfield. Early in the morning, Mrs. Preston was startled by the firing of 2 guns in quick succession, at a neighbor's house within half a mile of hers. Very shortly afterwards, Mr. Joseph Cloyd rode up on his plow horse with the gears on, telling Mrs. Preston that the Indians had killed his brother John, shot at him but missed him, although his shirt was powder burnt. They had gone to the house and he expected had killed his mother. Mrs. Preston sent a young man living at her house to Captain Francis Smith, who commanded a small fort on Craig Creek, to bring his troops to pursue the Indians. She wrote a letter to him which was free from tremor or trepidation. She then sent a white man and 2 black men to Mr. Cloyd's, where they found Mrs. Cloyd tomahawked in 3 places, and all the household destroyed. The money had been carried off. Mr. Cloyd had a large sum of gold stowed away. Mrs. Cloyd was perfectly in her senses, and told all the circumstances of the savages' revelry, in getting drunk, ripping up the feather beds, and one of them taking a corn cob and wiping off the blood from her temples. She died the next morning. After this eruption of the Indians, there appeared to be a pause in their depredations. I think about the year 1765, an expedition was ordered by the then governor of Virginia, Lord Bodecourt, and the command given to Colonel Byrd, who penetrated as far as the Tennessee line. What his success was, I am not able to state. I think, however, the settlements were insecure. In 1773, Colonel Preston became possessor of Draper's Meadows, now Smithfield. The county of Bodecourt was divided, and Colonel Preston was determined to follow the surveyor's office. Whilst Colonel Preston lived at Greenfield, Colonel John Buchanan determined to leave his residence near Pattonsburg and remove to Reed Creek to settle at Anchor and Hope, a splendid estate Colonel Patton had given his daughter Margaret. On his journey he stopped at Greenfield, took sick and died after several weeks' illness. Whilst on his deathbed, he desired Mrs. Preston to take charge of his daughter Jane, then 10 years old. This was done. Colonel Buchanan made Colonel Preston the executor of his immense estate. A long and unbroken friendship existed between them. Buchanan is favorably mentioned by General Washington in Sparks' Life of Washington. During Colonel Preston's residence at Greenfield in the year 1770, a young gentleman by the name of John Floyd was introduced to him by Colonel Joseph Cabell of Buckingham County, as very well qualified to a post as a deputy in the surveyor's office. It was always a rule with Colonel Preston to require of every young man who is employed in his office to teach school 6 months at least, thereby finding out his temper, diligence, habits, and trustworthiness. Mr. Breckenridge's and Smith's children and my sisters and brothers constituted Floyd's school. When my father removed to Smithfield in 1773, Colonel Floyd accompanied him. In the autumn of that year, Colonel Preston with Colonel Nathaniel Gist were appointed to make a treaty with the Cherokee, and I think the Chickamauga Indians, at Long Island on the Holstein River, in the future state of Tennessee. The treaty was made, and the Southern Indians were perfectly quiet. In the March of 1774, Colonel Preston removed my mother and her children to Smithfield. There was a fort or stockade around the house. Several of the neighbors' families came into it for safety, because the northwestern Indians made constant attempts on the settlements. Major John Taylor, who had married a niece of Colonel Buchanan, was one of the families. Mr. Robert Preston, Captain James Charlton, his brother Frank, and Captain John Lucas were mainly the persons who defended the fort. In June of 1774, my brother, Governor James Patton Preston, was born at Smithfield. Mrs. Preston's confinement was so protracted from typhus fever that a nurse for her infant was procured by the kindness of Mrs. Van Leer, who affectionately took upon herself that office. She was the mother of the Reverend John Van Leer. During the summer and autumn of 1774, the entire region of the northwest of the mountains of Virginia was put in commotion by the movements of the Indians on her borders. The governor of the state, Lord Dunmore, made a visit as far as Fincastle in Beaudecourt County to organize an expedition against the Shawnees, Wyandots, and Delaware Indians. General Andrew Lewis, who had served in Braddock's War as a colonel and in the Old French War as a major, was appointed to be the commander of the expedition. His youngest brother, Colonel Charles Lewis of Bath County, General Lewis's sons Samuel and Thomas Lewis, his nephew Thomas Lewis of Rockingham County, and Andrew John Lewis and his nephew-in-law, Captain Trigg, and Captain John McClanahan, were all in the army. I think Colonel William Criston, Colonel William Fleming, his brother-in-law Colonel John Stewart, and Colonel John Floyd were also in the campaign. The Battle of Point Pleasant was fought on the 10th of October, 1774. Colonel Charles Lewis was killed. Colonel Samuel Lewis was wounded. Captain John Lewis of Rockingham killed. Captain Trigg killed. And Captain McClanahan, as was Captain Monroe, the brother-in-law of Colonel Charles Lewis. Colonel Floyd was sent on a foraging expedition and did not arrive until the day after the battle. I remember distinctly to have read a letter from Colonel Thomas Lewis of Rockingham County to my father giving a detailed account of that battle. Colonel Preston was detained by the illness of Mrs. Preston, who was not expected to survive. The year after this battle, the country of Kentucky attracted much attention. Colonel Preston's surveyor's office comprehended all that beautiful state. Colonel Preston sent Colonel Floyd out on an exploring expedition, with a view to take up the lands for the benefit of Floyd and himself. For a long time it was supposed Floyd was killed by the Indians. However, he returned to Smithfield by routes of Wyandots, Coal River, etc., having endured hardships which few men could have survived. In the summer of 1776, the American Revolution fairly commenced, and all plans for a settlement west were suspended. Colonel Preston found himself surrounded by a neighborhood of Tories that kept him continually on alert to prevent their murdering himself and family, as well as every other Whig in the country. General William Campbell of Washington County, Colonel Arthur Campbell of the same county, a brother-in-law of General Campbell's, Colonel Patrick Lockhart of Beaudecourt County, William Madison, the son-in-law of Colonel Preston, were all good Whigs, and kept the Tories in check. Colonel Preston planned many of the military movements of that period. He was a man of consummate judgment and unremitting industry. He planned the campaign which made the demonstration in North Carolina that led to the battles of Guilford and Kings Mountain. His health had greatly declined from frequent apoplectic premonitions, yet he undertook as commandant of his county to march at the head of his regiment into North Carolina to join General Greene at Guilford. You will see an account of this matter in Lee's Memoirs of the Revolution. A skirmish had taken place between the Americans and British at Witzel's Mill, a short distance from the main battle. Colonel Preston was riding a very large, fiery young horse that took fright at the report of the guns, dashed through the mill pond, threw Colonel Preston off, who was likely to be cut down by the British light horse. At this critical moment, Colonel Joseph Cloyd dismounted, put Colonel Preston on his horse, and thereby saved his friend's and officer's life. This signal service was always held in memory by Colonel Preston, and a sincere friendship continued during Preston's life. Cloyd was the young man who escaped when his brother and mother were killed near Greenfield. Cloyd married an excellent, worthy lady without any fortune, which so displeased his father that he was banished from under the paternal roof. Preston furnished money to Cloyd, which enabled him to purchase the estate his son David Cloyd lives on. After Colonel Preston's return from North Carolina, his health continued to decline. In the month of June 1783, He had spent the evening with his intimate friend General Evan Shelby, the father of Governor Isaac Shelby. On the morning of the 28th, he prepared to attend a regiment muster at Michael Price's, 3 miles from Smithfield. The eldest son, General John Preston, then a youth, accompanied him, as did General Shelby. The day was exceedingly hot. After being on the field a few hours, he beckoned to his son John to come to him, complained of a pain in the head, desired to lie down on Price's bed. In a short time afterwards, he requested his son to help him on his horse. He wanted to go home. When the horse was brought to the door, he made an attempt to put his foot in the stirrup, sank down, was caught by his son, and laid on the bed again. By this time he had lost his speech, but took his son's hand, rolled up his shirt sleeve, and made a sign for his son to bleed him. This General Preston could not do. Mrs. Preston was sent for, who immediately reached the place. Colonel Preston's reason had not been staggered in this conflict. He caught his wife's hand, kissed it, shed tears, and made a motion to be bled. This could not be effected, from consternation and ignorance. Soon after, the stentorious breathing of apoplexy came on, and about midnight he breathed his last. Colonel Preston was above the ordinary height of men, 5 feet 11 inches. He was large, inclined to corpulency, was ruddy, had fair hair and hazel eyes. His manners were easy and graceful. He had a well-cultivated intellect and a fine taste for poetry. I remember reading several beautiful productions of his, addressed to my mother in praise of her domestic virtues. On the 18th of June, 1823, this excellent lady expired, after having lived a widow 40 years. She desired to be buried in the same grave with her husband. This was done. A tombstone was placed over the grave by their second son, General Francis Preston. No portrait of either was ever taken. I will now give you an account of your grandfather Floyd's family. Early in the last century, his ancestors emigrated from Wales and settled on the eastern shore of Virginia. Mr. William Floyd, the father of Colonel John Floyd, had 2 brothers, one named John who went north, and whose family, if he ever had one, is lost sight of. Charles, the youngest, went to Georgia, and is the ancestor of General John Floyd, of Darien in that state. William Floyd left the eastern shore, and went up the country as far as Amherst County, which was then a very wild region. He met with a family by the name of Davis, whose ancestors had come from Wales. They had traded with the Catawba Indians, and got much property in that way. The father of Robert Davis had married a half-breed Indian girl. This Robert Davis was the father of Miss Abadiah Davis, whom Mr. William Floyd married. Davis owned many of the rich lands of Amherst. His other daughters married a Mr. Venable and General Evan Shelby of Maryland. His oldest son, Robert Davis, emigrated even at that early date to Natchez, where many of his descendants live. John Floyd, the oldest son of William Floyd and Abadiah Davis, his wife, was born in 1757 in Amherst County, Virginia. At the age of 18, he married a Miss Burfoot. In 12 months after their marriage, Mrs. Floyd died, leaving a daughter of a few days old. The mother of Mrs. Floyd took charge of the child. Shortly afterwards, Colonel Floyd came to Beaudecourt and engaged in the business of teaching school and writing in the surveyor's office. He remained at Colonel Preston's until the year 1773. Whilst at Smithfield, his duties were arduous. Whenever the business of the surveyor's office did not require his personal attention, he rode as deputy sheriff with Colonel Daniel Trigg, both being employed by Colonel William Christian, the high sheriff. In the year 1775, Colonel Floyd went to Kentucky, where he made many surveys of all the best lands on Elkhorn Creek, many in Clark County and Woodford County, Shelby County, and Jefferson County. He returned to Smithfield after unparalleled sufferings. The Declaration of Independence had been made at this time. Dr. Thomas Walker, Edmund Pendleton, Colonel Preston, and 1 or 2 other gentlemen purchased a schooner, had it fitted up for a privateer, and gave the command to Colonel Floyd. I remember to have read a letter from Colonel Floyd to my father on board the privateer Phoenix. He sailed to the West Indies and obtained a very rich prize. Amongst the articles on board the merchantman was a very fine suit of wedding clothes for a lady. Colonel Floyd was at that time engaged to a Miss Jane Buchanan to be married. He thought his fortune was made in the rich cargo he had taken. On his return, whilst nearly in the sight of the Capes of Virginia, he was overhauled by a British vessel of war. Captured, he was taken to England, put in irons, and imprisoned. Whether it was in London or on the coast of England, I do not recollect. Whilst he was there, Colonel Radford was brought to the same prison. They were nearly a year confined. The jailer had a daughter to whom Colonel Floyd appealed so successfully that she obtained the keys and let him out. Colonel Radford told me when Floyd left them all the prisoners shed tears. So great a favorite he had made himself. Floyd begged his way to Dover, where he found a clergyman who was in the habit of concealing all American fugitives and procuring a passage for them to France. It was in the season of the vintage. The French gave him grapes and sometimes bread, and in this way he got to Paris, and applied to Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who furnished him with money and instructions to return to the United States. Whilst in Paris, Colonel Floyd was attacked with smallpox, which nearly cost him his life. During his sojourn, he obtained his wedding clothes, a rich and beautiful pair of brilliant shoe buckles for his intended bride, and a scarlet coat for himself. No intelligence of the privateer or its crew had reached the United States. The inference was that all was at the bottom of the sea. A year after, Colonel Robert Sayers, a distant kinsman of Miss Buchanan's, an officer in the army and a rich man, addressed the young lady. Sayers had requested her to walk with him in the garden, to which she consented, and whilst there she agreed to marry him. In an hour thereafter, Colonel Floyd arrived at Smithfield, much to the surprise and joy of his friends. Miss Buchanan's last engagement was immediately cancelled, and in the month of November 1778, she married Colonel Floyd. Soon afterwards they went to Johns Creek and settled there. Colonel Floyd's father and family had left Amherst, and were living on Johns Creek. He remained a year there and then determined to move to Kentucky. By this time their eldest son, William Preston Floyd, was born, in the month of October 1779. Colonel Floyd, his brothers Robert, Charles, and Isham, with his brothers-in-law the Master and Sturgis, husbands of his sisters Jemima and Abadiah, went with them. There were also two single sisters, one married a Mr. Pryor, the other a Mr. Alexander. The two oldest sisters, Mrs. Powell of Lynchburg and Mrs. Taylor, remained in Virginia, when the latter moved to Kentucky the autumn after her brother's death. Colonel Floyd went to his fine estate on Beargrass Creek, 6 miles from Louisville. He commenced building a fort, got the houses completed in a short time, and a good stockade made. The place was called Floyd Station. As soon as his family was secure, he commenced organizing the county. Mr. John Howard, Colonel Robert Todd, I think Benjamin Sebastian, and perhaps Judge Muter, and Judge Samuel McDowell, endeavored to arrange or enact laws for the better regulation of the people. When they convened to do so, Floyd made an address to them, saying, he felt he had placed his foot upon the threshold of an empire. This expression was looked upon as the boast of an ardent-tempered man. Time has proved that it was prophetic. Much unity existed among the first settlers of Kentucky. Colonel Floyd was frequently engaged in skirmishes with the Indians. Going one day to Louisville, he encountered a huge Indian within half a mile of his fort. He killed him and took all his ornaments of medals, brooches, and rifle. The Indian had silver enough in his ornaments to make a dozen of tablespoons. Some little time after this matter, Floyd rallied a company of 18 or 19 men, went about 10 miles from his fort, met a company of Indians, I think 16 in number. The attack was made by Floyd. They fought for several hours, and there were 14 of the whites killed, and 13 of the Indians. Floyd was wounded in the foot and made his escape through the generosity of General Wells, who dismounted from his horse and gave him to Floyd. In the spring of 1801, I passed by the battlegrounds. Governor Madison was my escort. He showed me a large beech tree with the names of the 14 soldiers carved on it, but it had so grown out that few of the names could be read. The bodies of the whites and Indians were collected, placed in a sinkhole near the field of battle, and covered with stones and limbs of trees. This encounter took place in a fork of Salt River, which has ever since been called Floyd's Fork of Salt River. What is the date of this incident I do not recollect. I think it was 1782, and you will find a statement of it in Mr. Humphrey Marshall's History of Kentucky. General George Rogers Clark was in Jefferson County about this time. He was commissioned by the state of Virginia to raise troops for the defense of Kentucky. The constant depredations of the Indians kept every man under arms. The Indians were instigated by the British Governor Hamilton to destroy the whites. Finding that they could not be driven out, he made a proposition to Clark and Floyd. If they would give up the country to the British, they should have as much boundary of the land on the west bank of the Ohio as they might wish, and any title under that of Duke. Each gentleman had received the proposition at the same time, but was afraid to divulge it. Floyd, having less caution than Clark, communicated the fact to Clark. They agreed to keep it concealed from the troops, who were so famished and discontented that if they had known how, they would have gone to any help to be fed and saved from the tomahawk of the ruthless savages. This incident was communicated to Mr. Charles Fenton Mercer upwards of 30 years ago by Mrs. Croghan, the sister of General Clark, and the mother of Colonel George C. Croghan of Sandusky memory. Mrs. Breckinridge had at this time corroborated the facts. In 1782, Mrs. Floyd gave birth to a son that her husband named George Rogers Clark, after his friend and fellow soldier. About this time, Isham Floyd was killed on the west bank of the Ohio. The Indians scalped him, cut off his ears, fingers, and toes, and after torturing him for 3 days, they cut out his heart and threw it to their dogs. On the 12th of April, 1783, Colonel Floyd, his brother Charles Floyd, and Alexander Breckinridge were going to Salt River about 20 miles from Floyd's station. Floyd wore a scarlet coat. On their return, a party of Indians attacked them, shot Floyd through the arm, and the ball entered his body. Floyd reeled on his horse, which his brother observing dismounted from his, jumped on his brother's horse, caught him round the body, and rode off in full speed to a house about 5 miles distant. By this time, Colonel Floyd was so exhausted from the loss of blood that he appeared to be dying. Nevertheless, he lived that night, talked much to his brother, expressed unmitigated sorrow for his young wife, the unborn infant, and his 2 little sons. He desired to be buried at his station on an eminence he had chosen for a graveyard. All this was fulfilled. On the 24th day of April, Mrs. Floyd gave birth to a son, whom she named John after his father. Colonel Floyd had bequeathed to his wife the beautiful estate he lived on. Colonel Floyd was 6 feet high, somewhat slender, formed symmetrically, his complexion dark, brilliant black eyes, very black straight hair, and fine white teeth. He was remarkable for his great beauty, generosity of temper, kindness of heart, and undaunted courage. There was in my father's possession a great number of letters from Colonel Floyd, giving details of nearly all the striking incidents of the early settlements of Kentucky. Colonel Preston's papers fell into the hands of his eldest son and Executor General John Preston. A family arrangement had been made that all the undivided lands belonging to Colonel William Preston should be divided among his children. Mr. Nathaniel Hart and Major William Preston were made agents for the Kentucky interest. General Preston put all Colonel Floyd's letters into Mr. Hart's hands. Dr. Floyd had often expressed a wish to obtain these letters, for the purpose at some future time to write a history of the early times of his native state. For some reason of General Preston's they were withheld. Mrs. Susanna Radford of Greenfield in Beaudecourt County has all the letters and papers that are extant, belonging to her grandfather Colonel William Preston. Colonel George Floyd continued in the army. He married a second time. The young lady was Miss Sally Fountain of Louisville. At the Battle of Tippecanoe, Colonel Floyd manifested the same undaunted courage that his ancestors had been conspicuous for. He was perfectly versed in Indian warfare, and expressed to General Harrison the day before the battle that the movements of the Indians augured some treachery. However, no heed was given to the expression. The whole army lay down to sleep on the night of the attack. Floyd was in his tent when the war whoop was heard. He jumped up, seized his sword, and at the door of the tent cut down an Indian, who was succeeded by a warrior with an uplifted tomahawk. Floyd seized it, struck the Indian with it, and killed him. All this was done in the colonel's shirt tail, because he had not time to put on his pantaloons. When Floyd returned to Louisville, all the surviving friends of his father met with him with great cordiality. In the official reports of the Battle of Tippecanoe, Colonel Floyd thought himself overlooked. He retired from the service. In June of 1823 he died at Woodville, and was buried near his father. There is a tombstone placed over him by his widow. He left 3 children. John G. Floyd, the son of his first wife, who was a cadet at West Point. From his fine attainments whilst there, he was made principal engineer to the state of Indiana. He resides at Terre Haute in that state. He married a Miss Hager, formerly of Baltimore. Colonel John Floyd, his brother Isham, his brother-in-law Lamaster, Sturgis, Pryor, Joseph Drake, William Buchanan, and John Buchanan were all killed during the Revolutionary War. From the year 1755 to the Battle of New Orleans, your paternal ancestors unsheathed the sword and poured out their blood for this country. The last of the Mohicans you'll remember in your grand-uncle Nathaniel Floyd, whose old age did not deter him from service at New Orleans. You recollect the utter destitution of that old age. I will add a fact. In all this service given, not 1 cent of public money was ever received by any individual of the whole race, except their daily compensation. I have done, my dear son. May this faithful history teach you to look more to individual interest than ever your ancestors have. Should you transcribe this, you will find many errors to correct from feeble hands and imperfect vision. Ever your affectionate mother, Letita Floyd. So that's it for this episode from the My Dear Rush letter written by Letita Preston Floyd to her son all the way back in 1843. This letter is a major source of information for genealogists, and there are probably some viewers of this channel who have ancestors in one of these families. There is some additional information on the Breckinridge family that I did not read in this letter. Genealogical research is one of the things that motivated me to start this channel, and one person I found in this research was Colonel John Floyd, who is my first cousin 8 times removed. His mother, Abadiah Davis, was my 7th great-grand-aunt. Comment below if you are related to any of these early families of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. At the beginning of this story, Letita Preston Floyd gave a more detailed account of Colonel Patton's death in 1755, and there are also several differences between hers and the Ingles family account of the Draper's Meadow Massacre. In this story, Mary Draper Ingles had a baby during captivity, because she was pregnant at the time of her capture. She also cast lots with the Dutch woman for which of them would kill and eat the other one, and she lost. Neither of these things were mentioned in John Ingles' account of his mother's captivity. We also heard about the death of Philip Barger in this story, including the fact that he was beheaded rather than scalped. So whose version of these events do you believe? Did Mrs. Ingles avoid telling of a child she left behind with the Indians, or was that some type of false rumor? Let us know what you think in the comments below. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that is viewed as unworthy of airtime on history channels on TV. We tell the forgotten stories of our ancestors whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support this channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have access to all of our members-only videos, and will be recognized for their contribution at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.